So big news from Ukraine as Russia announces it's abandoning the southern port city of Kherson. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So I must admit, after the excitement earlier this summer, as Ukrainian forces swept across the northern part of the country that was occupied by the Russians, I've been kind of frustrated by the slow pace of progress in the south. To be fair, they took back thousands of square miles that had been occupied by the Russians, actually taking back more property in the space of just a couple weeks than the Russians had taken in 5 months. And the Ukrainians have done a magnificent job of defending their territory from the ongoing attacks by the Wagner Group, who are desperate to try to increase Russia's presence in the Donbass region. But the south, that's where we've been expecting big advances by the Ukrainians, and we've yet to see them. And it's been getting worrisome given the fact that we're starting to get into the rainy season, which makes it harder for the Ukrainians to engage in their operations. Let's check out the map here. Okay, so this is Ukraine here. You can see down here in the bottom is Crimea, which is the area that was annexed by Russia in 2014. This red area here, this is the area in the Donbass where Russia has been supporting rebel forces against the Ukrainians since 2014. And in fact, this is the area where the rocket was shot off from that downed a Malaysian airliner. These lighter pink areas, though, are the areas that are currently occupied by the Russians. Now let's just kind of zoom in here a little bit to check out the north. This is the area where the Ukrainians had such a magnificent operation a couple months ago, taking back this whole green territory here that had been occupied by the Russians, taking advantage of a thorough collapse of the Russian operation. The Ukrainians did manage to cross to the other side of this reservoir near Kupiansk, and since then have established a pretty firm beachhead on the east side of this natural obstacle. The reason this is relevant is right here is Severodonetsk, the city that the Russians fought for months to take from the Ukrainians. And look how close the Ukrainians are right now. We can measure it. Only about 30 kilometers. That's less than 20 miles. But probably the key city that is in play right now up in this area is Svadova here. And you can see how it has a couple of roads that come together. The Ukrainians have already taken over access to this road here, but this other road here remains open to the Russians. And so if the Ukrainians are able to push east to Svadova, then that will cut off this whole area from resupply. Because you have to remember, again, we're getting into the rainy months when any kind of heavy equipment needs to go on roads or railroads. It's worth noting that this area here that the Ukrainians have taken are part of the Luhansk Oblast, one of the two oblasts or provinces in the Donbass, and the only one that the Russians actually were able to fully occupy. So the fact that they no longer have occupied this fully is a big embarrassment to the Russians. And the Ukrainians deserve a lot of credit for executing a magnificent campaign up here. Now over here is where the Wagner Group is attacking. These are the mercenaries led by former restaurateur and the man who's known as Putin's chef. Right here is the city of Bakhmut, and I'll zoom in a little bit further here. And you can see why they're trying to get here. You can see there are several roads that come together here. And frankly, the Russians have been pushing here for quite some time. You can see all the red arrows here pointing to their offenses. And they have made very little progress, despite enduring really horrific casualties. In fact, this is the area where we're hearing reports that the Russians are basically shooting conscripts and prisoners who are trying to run away from the lines. So now let's zoom out a little bit more and go south. This is the area where Ukraine has been engaged in their latest offensive. And the reason this is particularly an exciting and important move is because you can see right here, this river. This is the Dnipro River. And it separates the Russians here in Crimea and in direct contact with Russia from this western beachhead that they have here. This was an area that was occupied very early in the war. And in fact, Kherson here is the only provincial capital that has been occupied by the Russians. And it was occupied very early on in the war, before the Ukrainians were able to stop the Russian advance near Mykolaiv. Now, the reason this is so important are a couple of things. For starters, over here is Odessa, which is Ukraine's main port on the Black Sea. The Russians are desperate to take Odessa because of the fact that that would essentially landlock Ukraine and make it unable to ship its produce overseas, thereby pretty much destroying its economy. What's more is, this is Putin's land bridge that he's been trying to establish for some time between Russia and Crimea. you can see down here, this is the bridge, the Kerch Bridge, that was blown up by the Ukrainians, and how it goes between Crimea and Russia here. But without that access, you can see how hard it is for the Russians over here to communicate with Crimea, unless they have this land bridge here. So losing this territory here is endangering the Russian position here, essentially connecting Crimea with the rest of Russia. What's more is if you zoom in here a little bit, and once again, the Ukrainians have run a magnificent campaign here, basically destroying the bridges over the Dnipro River, making it impossible, or at least very difficult, for the Russians to be able to resupply their forces over here. But the one connection between the two that they have not been able to destroy is over here. This is the Nova Kakhovka Dam, and it essentially holds back all this water up here. If this dam were to be destroyed, it would flood this entire basin down here, all the way down to Kherson. Now, Kherson had at one point been a city of over 300,000 people. Now there's reportedly less than 50,000 civilians there. But still, that would devastate this entire region. The Russians have claimed that the Ukrainians were the ones going to destroy this dam. But again, we just have to look at which side has been the one engaging in wholesale war crimes against civilians to know which side really is the one planning on doing it. The Ukrainians are moving as quickly as they can to get down to this dam to seal it off and protect it from the Russians destroying it. What's more is it makes it even harder for the Russians then to be able to resupply their forces on the west side of the Dnipro River here. But there's an additional reason that this territory is so important to the Russians, and it has to do with this canal that you see here. That is actually a water source, the primary water source for Crimea. At one point, as the crisis had gotten worse, the Ukrainians had actually cut off this water supply, causing all kinds of problems for the Russians in Crimea. And if the Ukrainians are able to take back this dam, I have no doubt that they will once again block this water access for Crimea, causing a big problem for the Russians there. Now let's once more zoom out here. Part of the reason that the Russians have been able to cause so much trouble in the Black Sea has been the fact that they do occupy this territory here in the Kherson Oblast. If you can see down here is Sevastopol. This is the main port of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Now, as a result of the fact that the Ukrainians have been successful in staging some attacks there, the Russians have basically abandoned Sevastopol and moved their Black Sea Fleet further over here, back to Novorossiysk. You'll have to forgive me for my pronunciation there. But the point is that if the Ukrainians are able to retake the Kherson Oblast, then it basically destroys any potential for the Russians to be able to block off the Black Sea access that the Ukrainians have. And what's more is because of the fact that Russia relies upon this water source to supply Crimea, the Ukrainians will be able to cause all kinds of problems for the Russians down here. So the announcement that the Russians have decided to abandon Kherson is frankly not terribly surprising. In fact, reportedly, some top Russian generals have been pushing for this for some time. But Putin didn't want to actually abandon this territory because of the fact that it was such an early success in the war, and it will certainly be a big propaganda black eye for him. But beyond that, it spells the end of Russian hopes to take the entire Black Sea region of Ukraine, and in fact, it endangers the Russian position in Crimea. The bottom line is that this announcement is just more evidence of the fact that the Russians are dealing with big problems in Ukraine. Their offensive is going nowhere fast, and even though it seems like the lines have stalled for the past month or so, the reality is that the Ukrainians have kept up the pressure on the Russians, and despite their efforts to call up new recruits, the Russians continue to be in worse shape every day. Well, if you want to see another video about how the Ukrainians have repeatedly embarrassed Vladimir Putin, check out this video over here. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.